The soup can trick they laughed at until the U.S. sniper took down 112 enemies in 5 days. On March 18, 1944, the northern ridge of Bougainville was covered in damp vegetation and the smell of wet soil that had not fully dried from the night's rain. The area was known as Hill 72, a narrow elevation overlooking two approaches used frequently by Japanese scouts. It was not considered a major strategic feature, but enemy infiltration attempts in the sector had increased enough that the 37th Infantry Division needed constant observation on the ridge. At first light, a single American sniper moved slowly through the underbrush toward the highest point. He paused often, not because he was tired, but because he studied every sound around him. Private First Class Walter Hayes had been in the Pacific for almost a year. He was 24, from Ohio, and had worked before the war as a part-time mechanic while helping his father run a small rural workshop. He had a habit of taking apart radios, experimenting with sound direction, and building improvised devices that served no purpose outside his personal curiosity. Most soldiers in his company thought he was quiet to the point of oddness, but his officers trusted him. During training, he had shown unusual patience, strong marksmanship, and the ability to remain still for long periods without losing focus. He did not volunteer for sniper duty. The role came to him because he never rushed, never fired unless necessary, and always noticed details others ignored. His commanding officer, Captain Daniel Merriman, had called him in before dawn. Merriman understood the problem developing along their perimeter. Japanese patrols were repeatedly testing the lines under cover of dense vegetation. The ridge Hayes was being sent to overlooked two suspected infiltration routes, both narrow and concealed enough that a small enemy team could slip through without alerting the main American positions. Merriman needed someone who could stay hidden for long stretches, someone who would not panic if left alone, and someone observant enough to identify enemy movement long before a firefight broke out. Hayes fit all three requirements. His task was simple in wording but difficult in execution. Climb the ridge, establish a concealed hide, and observe any enemy movement. If the enemy attempted to advance, he was to stop them before they reached the lower perimeter. If nothing happened, he was to remain in place, silent and unseen. Hayes carried his Springfield rifle, a pair of scratch binoculars, and a small cloth bag containing the unusual device that had drawn laughter from the other men the previous evening. It was a rusted soup can, cut open, cleaned, polished inside, and modified with a narrow slit across the rim. Hayes had used spare hours during lulls in combat to refine it little by little. It was his attempt to create a directional tool for identifying faint sounds and small light reflections. He had learned through trial and error that the interior surface of the can concentrated certain sounds when angled precisely, allowing him to pick out directional cues that were otherwise lost in the uniform drone of the jungle. The idea was unconventional and made him the subject of jokes, but he did not defend it. He simply believed it worked, and that was enough for him. He reached the top of Hill 72 shortly after sunrise. The ridge was uneven and cluttered with roots and branches. A fallen banyan tree stretched across the slope, its trunk hollow at the base where previous storms had loosened the soil. Hayes crouched beside it, inspected the interior space, and confirmed that it offered a stable firing position with a clear view of both suspected approaches. He slid inside, brushed aside loose leaves, and adjusted his gear so that nothing reflected sunlight. His hide became a narrow pocket in the base of the tree, concealed by broken roots and shadows. Before settling fully, Hayes lifted the soup can and slowly rotated it. At a certain angle, a faint metallic tap reached him, sharp, distant, and irregular. It was not an animal. It was equipment being moved carefully against another object. Hayes shifted the can a few degrees until the sound lined up consistently. Through the binoculars, he studied the basin below and spotted the top of a Japanese scout's helmet partially visible between ferns. The scout advanced slowly, scanning the terrain ahead and stepping over a fallen branch without making noise. Hayes steadied the rifle, exhaled, and fired one controlled shot. The scout collapsed into the vegetation without alerting others. The jungle returned to its normal ambient sounds. Hayes waited several minutes before moving the can again. Another faint reflection caught his attention, a short flash of light bouncing off a wet surface. A second enemy scout crawled forward, his movements low and cautious. Hayes did not fire immediately. He waited until the man paused behind a stump and raised his head slightly. One more shot into the movement. Throughout the morning, similar patterns continued. Small enemy elements appeared at irregular intervals, each approaching with caution but unaware of the hidden sniper above them. Hayes remained still except for the slow rotation of the soup can and the gradual adjustment of his rifle. By midday, he had engaged 9 enemy soldiers, all without drawing return fire. When he transmitted the report to headquarters, the tone of the reply was casual and joking. One voice asked if he was sure he was not shooting at shadows, but Hayes ignored the comment. He knew exactly what he saw and heard. After cleaning his rifle and reinforcing the cover around his position, he opened his small notebook and recorded a brief line summarizing the day's events. He noted the number of enemy scouts, the direction of their movement, and the increased activity in the basin. His handwriting was neat and steady. While other soldiers might have taken the quiet intervals as a moment to relax, Hayes used them to review the terrain, listen to changes in the jungle's background noise, and prepare for the possibility of increased infiltration attempts during the night. As evening settled over the ridge, Hayes remained inside his hide, alert and silent. The first day had revealed more activity than expected, and the movements suggested an organized pattern. He understood that the Japanese were testing the ridge's vulnerabilities. He also understood that if they continued at this pace, the following days would not remain quiet. His task was simple, but the responsibility behind it was significant. As long as he held this ridge, the enemy would not pass unnoticed. He settled deeper beneath the banyan roots, adjusted the soup can within reach, and waited for the next sound to guide him. Hayes remained awake long after the ridge darkened. The jungle's nighttime sounds were different from the daytime ones. Louder in some areas, quieter in others, with long pauses that felt intentional. He had learned during earlier deployments that the Japanese often used those pauses to mask movement. Every time the insects fell silent or the frogs stopped croaking, he lifted the soup can and angled it toward the basin. Most of the time, he heard nothing. But at 3:42, a soft metallic click reached him through the can, faint but distinct enough to confirm that at least 2 men were moving below the slope. He shifted his position slightly, keeping his body behind the thickest roots of the banyan tree. The ridge carried sounds unevenly, so he focused on the direction where the noise remained consistent. Through the darkness, he noticed the faint outline of a soldier adjusting his gear. Hayes fired once. A second figure froze, unsure of the direction of a shot. When that figure turned his head, Hayes took the second shot as well. Both men fell silently. The jungle remained unaware. When morning arrived, the humidity clung tightly to Hayes' clothing. He had slept no more than a few minutes here and there. He drank a measured sip from his canteen, careful not to use too much. Water resupply was not guaranteed for someone sent alone to an observation post. He tightened the strap of his helmet, wiped the moisture off his rifle stock, and returned to scanning the slope. As the sun rose higher, the ridge revealed more signs of enemy movement. Leaves were disturbed in narrow trails that did not exist the day before. Several branches lower on the slope shifted slightly, out of sync with the wind. Hayes raised the soup can again and caught a short flash of reflected light. It came from the metal buckle of a Japanese soldier crawling through the undergrowth. He steadied the rifle. One shot, then another. By late morning, he had neutralized several small teams. None of them managed to approach closer than 70 yards. Hayes remained calm, patient, and deliberate. His hide was secure, and he did not waste a single round. During a brief lull, he thought about the months leading up to this assignment. When he first arrived in the Pacific, Hayes struggled to adjust to the environment. The heat was constant, the insects unrelenting, and the terrain offered almost no long sight lines for a trained marksman. But over time he adapted. He learned to read shadows, listen for weight shifts in soil, and study the small inconsistencies that most soldiers overlooked. Other men relied on instinct. Hayes relied on observation. That difference made him valuable, even if his personality and improvised equipment drew occasional jokes. Merriman understood this, which is why he trusted Hayes with assignments that required complete silence and long periods of isolation. At 11:14 a.m., he detected movement again. 3 enemy scouts advanced cautiously through the ferns, spreading out to minimize exposure. Their spacing suggested they were trained infiltration personnel, not regular infantry. Hayes observed the lead man pause behind a tree, signaling for the others to hold. Hayes waited until the man shifted his rifle slightly, revealing a sliver of his helmet. Hayes fired once, then adjusted, tracked the second scout, and fired again. The third attempted to retreat, but he moved too quickly through a patch of sunlight. Hayes took him before he disappeared into the brush. The radio crackled later that afternoon. Headquarters requested an updated count. Hayes responded with the same calm tone he always used. The operator on the other end repeated the number back in disbelief, then asked whether Hayes was certain. Hayes ignored the tone, confirmed the number, and closed the radio. He returned immediately to scanning the slope. By late afternoon, the enemy presence increased noticeably. Individual scouts began appearing more frequently, some of them approaching from angles Hayes had not previously considered. This suggested a coordinated effort to probe the ridge rather than random patrols. Hayes adjusted accordingly. He shifted his hide 3 feet to the left, using a thicker section of the banyon's base to minimize silhouetting. He also reinforced the upper portion of his cover with mud to hide any exposed equipment. Evening approached slowly, and the sky dimmed under heavy clouds. Hayes rechecked his ammunition supply and counted his remaining water. He knew he would not be relieved that night. He also understood that the enemy was still probing, waiting for darkness to make a larger push. He braced himself for a long night, one in which he would have to rely more heavily on sound than on sight. As the final daylight faded, Hayes recorded his observations in his notebook. The handwriting reflected his mental state, controlled, steady, and systematic. He wrote the times of each engagement, the pattern of enemy movement, and the direction of their approach. He added a simple note at the bottom: activity increasing. Expect more tonight. He closed the notebook and positioned himself deeper under the banyon's roots. He lifted the soup can once more and angled it toward the basin, waiting for the next sound to guide his rifle. The ridge felt different now. The enemy was testing it with purpose, not curiosity. Hayes understood exactly what that meant. The real push had not even started yet. Night settled over the ridge with a heaviness that made every sound stand out sharply. Hayes kept his cheek against the rifle stock, his body pressed into the hollow beneath the banyan roots, shifting only when his muscles cramped. He listened first, then watched, then listened again. The insects that usually filled the jungle with constant noise now fell silent in irregular waves, creating brief pockets of stillness that made him tighten his grip on the soup can. Those breaks in sound often meant movement. At 2:17, he heard controlled breathing that did not belong to any animal. It came from 2 separate positions, both lower on the slope. The men moved slowly and deliberately, stepping around branches rather than breaking them. Hayes lifted the soup can, rotated it the way he had practiced hundreds of times, and aligned the slit with the faintest glimmer of reflected moisture on a helmet. He waited until one of the scouts leaned forward slightly. A single shot dropped him. The second man froze. Hayes tracked him through a gap in the leaves and fired again. After confirming no additional movement, he returned to listening. By 4 o'clock, fatigue had begun to affect him. His eyes burned from strain. His fingers ached from maintaining constant stability on the rifle. He allowed himself a brief moment to stretch his shoulders, then returned to scanning the darkness. The ridge had become an extension of his task. Everything beyond the banyan tree felt distant. His mission was clear: stop enemy scouts before they reached the lower perimeter, prevent infiltration, and hold the ridge alone for as long as needed. When dawn finally approached, the sky lightened by slow degrees. Hayes used the brief increase in visibility to reassess the terrain. Several new trails had formed overnight, narrow disturbances in the vegetation where enemy scouts had crawled. None of them reached the top of the ridge. All had been intercepted. This confirmed that the enemy was actively searching for a weakness along the slope. At 6:41, he detected movement again. Two Japanese soldiers were advancing in a staggered formation, using shrubs and fallen logs for cover. They stopped frequently, studying the ridge with careful attention. Hayes remained motionless. He waited until the lead soldier exposed part of his uniform while adjusting his rifle strap. Hayes fired once, then adjusted to engage the second man who attempted to retreat. Both fell within seconds. He continued monitoring the basin after each engagement, noting how the enemy began to hesitate before moving. Their pauses grew longer. Their route changes became more frequent. This told Hayes that they now understood resistance existed somewhere on the ridge, but had not yet determined the exact location of the shooter. He used this uncertainty to his advantage, switching firing angles slightly and shifting his body weight to avoid leaving patterns in movement. By midday on the third day, the frequency of contact intensified. Hayes counted 3 small patrols attempting separate approaches within a single hour. One group moved along a narrow depression in the terrain, hoping to use the lower angle to conceal themselves. Hayes spotted the reflection of a rifle barrel through the soup before they made their final advance. He fired 4 shots, each placed carefully to avoid revealing too much of his position. Another group attempted to use higher ground on the left flank. Hayes shifted position 3 feet, placed his rifle along a new sight line, and neutralized them before they crossed a line of exposed roots. The engagements were constant now. Hayes barely had time to breathe between each one. He rationed his movements as much as he rationed his water. Every unnecessary shift of his body risked noise or exposure. Sweat accumulated under his helmet. His uniform stuck to his skin. His arms and legs remained tense from holding fixed positions for long stretches. During a short break in enemy activity, Hayes took note of his physical condition. He had slept very little in the past 2 days, eaten only a few bites of his cold rations, and consumed less water than his body required. Yet he understood that leaving the hide, even briefly to rest or drink deeply, would jeopardize the ridge. The enemy's probing was no longer random or timid. It was organized, relentless, and aimed at exploiting even the smallest lapse in observation. At 15:12, he encountered the closest threat yet. A Japanese machine gun assistant advanced too far up the slope and unknowingly came within 50 yards of Hayes' position. The soldier scanned the area with deliberate care. Hayes held perfectly still, barely moving his eyes. The man paused, adjusting the strap on his pack. Hayes fired 1 controlled shot that brought him down instantly. Moments later, 2 additional scouts emerged, startled by the sudden loss of their teammate. Hayes took them as well before they could fire blindly into the ridge. As evening approached, the light dimmed behind the canopy. Hayes used the final daylight to renew minor adjustments to his hide. He pressed mud along exposed sections of the banyan's base, reinforced the edges of his firing position, and checked each cartridge in his ammunition supply. He ensured every element of his gear was within reach, knowing the 4th night could be the most difficult yet. Before darkness fully settled, he opened his notebook. His handwriting showed slight shaking from fatigue, but his notes remained precise. He recorded the number of enemy scouts engaged, the increasing pace of movement, and the clear indication that the enemy was shifting tactics. At the bottom of the page, he wrote a single sentence. Pattern suggests larger infiltration attempt pending. He closed the notebook gently, returned it to his pack, and positioned himself once more beneath the banyan roots. The humidity grew thicker. The jungle sounds changed again. Hayes raised the soupkin toward the basin, listening for anything that might break the rhythm of the night. The ridge had not yet reached its most critical moment. Hayes could sense it through every sound, every shift of vegetation, every pause in the jungle's natural noise. What had begun as routine observation was now becoming a sustained test of endurance, precision, and patience. The fourth day began before sunrise, though Hayes had no clear sense of when night truly transitioned into morning. His body had reached a level of exhaustion where short bursts of rest blended with periods of alertness. He kept his hands on the rifle and the soup, even while drifting in and out of shallow sleep. Every time a branch shifted or a distant animal call changed pitch, he opened his eyes immediately. Just after first light, the humidity increased enough that a light fog settled over the ridge. The fog did not fully obscure visibility, but it softened outlines and made depth perception more difficult. Hayes adjusted by relying more heavily on sound. He tilted the soup slowly, aligning it with the faint echoes of movement along the left side of the slope. Two soldiers were advancing together, keeping low. Hayes remained motionless until he confirmed both positions. He fired twice. The fog absorbed the sound quickly, leaving the ridge silent again. As the light improved, the terrain revealed signs that the enemy had attempted multiple approaches during the night. Several narrow trails of compressed ferns indicated crawling movements that had stopped abruptly. The basin area looked disturbed in multiple locations, suggesting that scouts were mapping different paths toward the ridge. Hayes studied these signs with the same focus he applied to shooting. Understanding how the enemy moved allowed him to anticipate their next steps. At 9:32, he spotted a three-man team approaching from the right flank. Their uniforms were damp, and their movements were organized. They paused behind a large tree, communicated quietly, then continued forward. Hayes lined up his rifle. The first shot hit the point man. The other two ducked immediately and attempted to locate the origin of the shot. They scanned the upper ridge carefully, but Hayes' position offered no reflection or silhouette. He waited until one of them shifted to his knees to gain a better angle. Hayes fired again. The last soldier attempted to retreat, but a partial reflection from his equipment appeared through the soup can, giving Hayes the exact location. The final shot ended the movement. He adjusted his breathing, wiped sweat from his forehead, and checked the terrain again. The air was growing hotter, and the ridge provided no relief. His uniform clung to his back, and every movement made the dried mud crack at the seams. He drank the smallest possible amount of water, aware that he had less than half a canteen remaining. Relief would not arrive until the infiltration threat decreased, and that did not seem imminent. Shortly after noon, Hayes encountered the most coordinated enemy attempt yet. Two groups of scouts advanced simultaneously from separate directions. One group used the cover of a fallen log to approach the central slope, while the other moved along a shallow depression on the left. Hayes observed both teams for nearly a full minute before acting. He assessed which group presented the immediate threat to the lower American perimeter. The team in the depression had the clearest path toward the ridge's forward edge. Hayes angled his rifle downward and targeted the lead scout. The shot dropped him instantly. The second scout in that group reacted quickly, lowering his body and staying completely still, blending into the vegetation. Hayes waited. He did not fire again until he saw the subtle rise of the scout's back as he inhaled. He took the shot. Once that group was neutralized, he shifted to engage the team near the fallen log. They were already in motion, attempting to pull back. Hayes fired 2 more rounds, hitting both before they disappeared fully from sight. For the next half hour, he heard scattered movement, but no clear sight lines. Several branches broke under weight farther down the slope. These noises indicated that larger enemy elements were trying to reposition after losing multiple scouting teams. Hayes kept his rifle raised and the soup can angled, tracking the general direction of movement. He did not fire unless he confirmed a clear target. Conserving ammunition was just as important as accuracy. At 14:10, a sudden burst of gunfire struck the roots of the banyan tree. Bark splintered upward, and dirt landed across Hayes' hands. The enemy had finally fired back with intention. Hayes pressed into the soil, waiting to determine the angle of attack. A second burst followed, slightly to the left. This told him the shooter had a rough idea of the ridge's elevation, but still lacked his precise location. Hayes used the few seconds between bursts to locate the muzzle flash. With the soup can raised, he caught a faint glint through the vegetation. He rotated his rifle toward it and waited for the next flash. When it appeared, he fired one round through the gap. The return fire stopped immediately. That exchange confirmed that the enemy now understood resistance on the ridge was more than random. They were attempting targeted action, searching for the shooter's position with deliberate aggression. Hayes reinforced the left side of his hide with additional soil and broken branches, reducing the chance of reflective surfaces. He adjusted his shooting position a few inches inward to prevent establishing a predictable pattern. The rest of the afternoon unfolded in a series of tense engagements. A machine gun crew attempted to approach the left flank. Hayes intercepted them by targeting the assistant first, forcing the gunner to abandon the weapon before setting up. A separate pair of infiltration specialists used camouflage and slow, deliberate crawling. Hayes detected their movement only because a single leaf shook in an unnatural direction when one of them shifted his weight. He eliminated them with 2 steady shots. By late afternoon, his clothing was soaked again, this time from sweat rather than rain. His arms trembled occasionally from fatigue, and the long periods of stillness caused his muscles to stiffen. But he did not break focus. He had trained himself to control these physical limits. His task was the ridge, and nothing else mattered until the infiltration attempts ended. When the last light began to fade, Hayes used the dim glow to clean the mud off his rifle's bolt and check for debris. He took a measured sip of water, swallowed a small portion of rations, and looked over the terrain once more. The basin remained heavily disturbed. The enemy had clearly shifted tactics throughout the day, and their movements suggested preparation for something larger. He opened his notebook and recorded each engagement. The entries showed increasing intensity, more coordinated enemy behavior, and a continuous rise in attempted infiltration routes. At the bottom he wrote, Day 4, increased coordination. Expect major push soon. He closed the notebook, placed it carefully beside him, and prepared himself for the longest night of the operation. The jungle around him grew quiet, not with calm, but with anticipation. Hayes lifted the soup can and waited, listening for the smallest change that would signal the next approach. The 5th day began with a level of tension Hayes had not yet experienced on the ridge. The air was heavier than usual, and the jungle remained unusually still even after sunrise. He had slept only in scattered seconds during the night, jolting awake each time the insects fell silent or a distant branch shifted. His arms were numb from remaining in one position for too long. His legs were stiff. His throat felt dry enough that swallowing hurt. His canteen was nearly empty, but he resisted the urge to finish it. He knew he could not count on relief until the infiltration threat ended. As daylight filtered through the canopy, the ridge revealed more signs of enemy movement than the previous days. Several new trails cut through the vegetation, all leading toward points Hayes had engaged the day before. These trails showed clearer footprints and heavier depressions, indicating that larger enemy groups had been moving through the night. Hayes studied them with slow, deliberate concentration, mentally mapping the directions and estimating potential follow-on routes. At 7:18, he detected the first advance of the day. A scout team of 4 men approached from the right flank. Their spacing was wider, their posture lower, and their movements synchronized. This group demonstrated a higher level of training than most of the scouts he had engaged previously. Hayes observed them through narrow openings in the foliage. He waited until the lead scout raised his head to check the slope. Hayes fired once. The shot echoed sharply, causing the remaining 3 to freeze briefly before attempting to reposition. Hayes tracked the second man as he crawled behind a fallen log and fired again. The last 2 tried to retreat in separate directions. Hayes eliminated one, and the remaining scout disappeared into the undergrowth, but left enough movement in the ferns for Hayes to follow. The 4th shot ended the advance. Hayes exhaled slowly and adjusted his position. His shoulder ached from repeated recoil, and the skin on his cheek was irritated from the rifle stock. He ignored the discomfort. He wiped sweat from his hands, checked the chamber, and scanned the terrain again. The ridge remained active. At 9:03, a three-man machine gun team emerged from the basin. They carried their weapon carefully, pausing often, searching for signs of the sniper who had stalled their infiltration attempt for days. Hayes recognized that if they succeeded in setting up the machine gun, they could suppress the ridge long enough for additional troops to push through. He prioritized them immediately. The assistant gunner adjusted the tripod, exposing part of his uniform. Hayes fired, dropping him. The gunner attempted to raise the weapon, but hesitated when he realized his assistant was down. Hayes took the second shot. The third man ducked behind a mound of ferns and remained still. Hayes did not fire blindly. He waited. After nearly 20 seconds, the man shifted his weight to his elbow. Hayes fired the final round that ended the threat. The noise of the engagements drew more attention from below. Additional enemy soldiers moved into new positions, attempting to flank Hayes' hide from both sides. Their steps were quicker and less cautious now, indicating that they were coordinating a broader push rather than small probing teams. Hayes listened carefully with the soup can, adjusting it until he identified separate clusters of movement at varying distances. At 11:47, a larger formation of approximately 15 men advanced along the left approach. They moved in a staggered pattern, with one soldier directing hand signals to the others. Hayes recognized the formation as a deliberate infiltration group rather than standard scouts. Their posture, spacing, and communication suggested they intended to force access through the ridge by overwhelming it. Hayes steadied himself. He pressed his body deeper into the roots, aligned his rifle, and slowed his breathing. The first soldier stepped into a patch of exposed soil. Hayes fired. The formation reacted immediately, dropping low and spreading out. Hayes shifted to a secondary firing angle he had prepared earlier and targeted a soldier attempting to crawl behind a bush. The man fell. A third soldier ran toward a cluster of trees for cover. Hayes intercepted him before he reached it. The remaining men began returning fire, sending rounds blindly toward the ridge. Bark splintered above Hayes' head. One bullet tore through his sleeve, cutting a shallow line across his upper arm. Hayes pressed his hand against the wound briefly, confirmed it was superficial, and returned to firing. He tracked their muzzle flashes, using the soup can to identify each new firing position. One by one, he eliminated them. The firefight lasted nearly 40 minutes. When the last enemy soldier fell silent, Hayes lowered his rifle and rested his head against the inside of the banyan root. His breathing was uneven, and the wound on his arm burned. He reached for his canteen, tilted it slightly, and took a measured sip. There was barely enough water left to dampen his mouth. The ridge fell completely quiet. Even the insects remained subdued. Hayes knew the enemy had invested significant manpower into that assault. The fact that the attack had been repelled meant only one thing. They would reevaluate their strategy. Whether they attempted another push or withdrew entirely depended on how much they believed remained on the ridge. Hayes checked his ammunition. The number of remaining rounds was lower than he preferred, but still workable. He reinforced his hide again, pulling soil toward the base of the roots to conceal any exposed surfaces. He removed the dried mud from the rifle bolt and ensured the mechanism remained smooth. His hands trembled slightly from exhaustion and dehydration, but he controlled the movement by slowing his breathing. The sun continued to rise, intensifying the heat on the ridge. Hayes used the soup can again to monitor sound, mapping faint echoes of movement deeper in the basin. Most of the noise indicated retreat rather than continued advance. He stayed alert, ready for any final approach, but the jungle remained quiet long enough for him to recognize that he had broken the momentum of the infiltration effort. By late afternoon, no new enemy movement had emerged. Hayes remained in position, unwilling to relax until he had full confirmation. His notebook lay beside him, untouched for several hours. When he finally picked it up, he wrote a single, careful entry: major push repelled. Holding position, he closed the notebook and listened to the ridge again. The silence no longer signaled an incoming attack. It signaled the collapse of the infiltration attempt. The fifth day was not over yet, but the ridge had reached a turning point. Hayes remained ready, rifle in hand, waiting for the next sound that might require action. For the first time in days, none came. The night after the fifth day passed with an unusual level of stillness. Hayes expected one final attempt, a last coordinated push, or at least scattered movement as the enemy reorganized. But the jungle remained still. The absence of sound did not bring him comfort. He stayed in the same firing position beneath the banyan roots, holding the rifle across his forearms, his eyes alert despite the exhaustion weighing down his body. His throat was dry, his arm ached from the minor wound, and his legs were stiff from days without proper rest. Yet he did not loosen his grip. When daylight returned, it crept through the canopy slowly. Hayes raised the soup can immediately and swept it across the basin. For several minutes, he heard nothing beyond the natural rhythm of insects and distant birds. Then, at 9:12, he caught the first sign of movement since the large assault the previous day. 3 Japanese scouts moved cautiously through the lower brush. Their uniforms were dirt-stained, and their posture suggested fatigue. They did not advance quickly. They stopped often, studying the terrain ahead. Hayes watched them without moving his head. The scouts were not probing for a weak route. They were attempting to determine whether the ridge remained occupied. Their pace reflected uncertainty. The lead scout paused behind a tree and raised his rifle slightly. The motion confirmed their intention to test the ridge one final time. Hayes steadied his rifle. The first shot dropped the lead scout instantly. The remaining 2 recoiled in surprise and retreated in different directions. Hayes tracked one through a thin opening in the foliage and fired again. The second scout fell. The third disappeared into dense brush, leaving no clear line of fire. Hayes did not pursue him with additional shots. His task was not to hunt, it was to stop infiltration. After that brief engagement, the ridge returned to silence. Hayes angled the soup can toward all potential approaches, listening for any follow-up activity. Nothing came. He waited another hour before shifting his body. His muscles protested the movement, and his arms trembled from fatigue as he repositioned his rifle. At 11:03, the radio crackled. The voice from headquarters was steady, but clearly relieved. "Hey, stand by. Patrol is moving to your position. Hold tight." Hayes acknowledged the message with a short reply. He did not lower his weapon. He remained alert, scanning the ridge until he had full confirmation that friendly forces were approaching. It took nearly 30 minutes before he heard the controlled footsteps of the American patrol climbing the slope. Their pattern was distinct from enemy movement, heavier, more direct, and without the careful pauses scouts used. The first soldier to appear wore a corporal's insignia and raised a hand to signal approach. Hayes kept his rifle pointed downward, but did not relax until he confirmed the entire patrol was friendly. When the men reached him, they paused at the sight of his hide. Hayes looked worn, his uniform soaked with sweat and dirt, his helmet pushed slightly back, his face unshaven and pale. The corporal knelt beside him and asked quietly, "You been up here this whole time?" Hayes nodded once. The corporal scanned the ground below the ridge and then examined the scattered trails of disrupted vegetation across the slope. Another soldier picked up the soup can that lay beside Hayes' pack. He turned it in his hand, studying the improvised device. "This is what you used?" he asked. Hayes confirmed with another nod. The soldier shook his head in disbelief and handed it to the corporal, who examined the polished interior and narrow slit before returning it carefully. The patrol leader asked for Hayes' notebook. Hayes handed it over without hesitation. The corporal flipped through the pages, his expression tightening as he read the numbers. When he reached the final count, he paused. The page showed clear handwriting despite the fatigue behind it. 112 confirmed enemy stops over the course of 5 days. No spotter, no support, no rotation, just one sniper on a ridge holding a critical infiltration route. The corporal closed the notebook slowly. His voice was low and controlled as he said, "Command needs to see this." Hayes attempted to stand, but his legs buckled slightly from stiffness. 2 soldiers reached out to support him. He steadied himself and followed them down the slope. The sunlight flickered through the canopy as they descended, and each step reminded him of the long hours he had spent without leaving the hide. The walk felt unfamiliar, as if his body had forgotten how to move freely. When they reached the base of the ridge, The division staff took the notebook, verified the notes, and examined the terrain themselves. They found no inconsistencies. The infiltration attempt had been real. The scale was significant, and Hayes had stopped it alone. There was no ceremony, no immediate commendation. The war was still active, and the division had other operations to prepare for. But word spread quietly among the men. Those who had laughed at the soup can device no longer joked about it. Some asked Hayes how he built it. Others simply nodded when they passed him, acknowledging what he had done, even if they did not fully understand how. In the days that followed, the ridge remained secure. Enemy patrols in that area decreased sharply. Intelligence reports confirmed that the Japanese unit responsible for the infiltration attempt had pulled back to reorganize. They had suffered losses they could not afford during a period when resources and manpower were already strained. Hayes returned to routine duties with the same quiet demeanor he had always shown. He did not speak often about those 5 days. When asked for details, he gave brief, factual descriptions. When asked about the homemade device, he only said that it helped him hear direction better. He showed no interest in recognition. He focused on his tasks, just as he had done on Hill 72. The ridge he defended never received a formal name, and his stand did not appear in major reports or newspapers. Larger battles overshadowed it. Bigger strategic movements drew attention away from smaller engagements. But for the men who studied his notebook and walked the ground where he had fought, the significance was clear. One soldier had prevented a dangerous infiltration that could have cost many American lives. His actions remained part of internal unit memory, passed along quietly but not forgotten by those who understood the weight of what he accomplished. The ridge eventually returned to stillness, covered again by new vegetation and the steady rhythm of the jungle. But for 5 days in 1944, it had been held by a single sniper using a rifle, a simple homemade tool, and a level of patience and precision that shaped the outcome of an entire sector.